Welcome everyone. As Terry said, we have a full house effectively. We have to expand our GoToWebinar account to take everyone, which is a good sign. It means that capital planning is something that's a forefront of people's minds that are involved in clubs. I'm going to dive right in. We have about an hour. As Terry said, if you have any questions or comments, please shoot them through the chat box in real time. I'd rather take them than wait till the end. It's a way to make sure that we're all engaged. So what we're talking about today is proper capital planning. It is educational, but to be transparent on the front end, it's also related to a new platform and service that we have recently released. And the reason that we released it has everything to do with the things that we've learned from studying data for quite a while now. But we're always studying data. We're constantly learning and evolving. It's kind of interesting, this data-driven approach for clubs. It not only affects clubs, it affects club benchmarking. It affects the way we evolve. I liken it to Hansel and Gretel following the breadcrumbs to the cabin. That's what we're doing. We're just studying the data, and the data leads us where we should go. For the first 7 years of our company's existence, we focused on the income statement and the operating ledger, which is exactly what the industry does, even to this day. But at that point, we started to look at the balance sheet and the capital ledger, and there's reasons for that, which I won't go into now, but are related to doing specific work with a few specific clubs. And that work has led to several epiphanies, I guess. And what we're going to review today is a lot of that, the result of that, not just what we've learned, but what we've done with a number of clubs and the results that have been produced. So everything that we're talking about in this session is really educational. There's going to be a time or two where you might think I'm making a sales pitch, which to be frank, I am, because I think we've come upon something that I believe will change the industry and change every club. And that's why we're here. So we're going to focus on capital planning and financial outcomes, which are one and the same in the club industry. There's some stuff on the front end here, some material that many folks who follow what we write and what we do in some of our webinars, it may seem redundant and repetitive. It is, but it's critical because it's the context for everything. So one of the things, you know, at a very high level at the beginning here, we've now amassed over 400 clubs worth of data for 2022. And it's very clear we'll end up with 1,000 or so when we finish accumulating all the data. It's just March now. We're ahead of where we usually are. But one thing has become clear based on the financial data we've amassed or aggregated for 2022. Financially, the industry's back to where it was prior to the pandemic. In this sense, the amount of government input has gone away, and thus the operating ledger, which for the 2 years of the pandemic was buttressing capital because most clubs generated an operating surplus of some substance because of the ERTC. It's clear that's gone away. The median club now, and I'll show you this in a minute, had last year broke even, right on the noggin, 0% margin operationally. So that is behind us, I would say. With the benefits that occurred during the pandemic, and they're mainly, the main benefit, you know, the government income was a benefit, but it wasn't the main benefit. The main benefit, as we all know, was the growth in interest in clubs, which was partly related to the pandemic, but it may also be a demographic shift that's occurring in terms of the baby boomers transitioning to the millennials. The average age for joining a private club is 42. The number of 42-year-olds in the US is going to grow linearly and significantly, about 30% growth between now and 2032 as the millennials come of age to join clubs. So we're on the front end of that, and that kind of coincided with the pandemic. So as a result, the number of clubs with a wait list, according to our data, has gone from 25% to 50%, and the median initiation fee in clubs with golf has gone from about $25,000 to about $50,000. So that's had a fundamental impact on capital income, and the growth of members has gone up marginally in the clubs that didn't have a wait list before the pandemic, which was about a quarter of the industry, as I said. So that's all positive. However, and this is a message for the many clubs that are in the yellow and red buckets, if that benefit is not seized upon today, in a few years, the financial benefit of those things will begin to wane. So even with that benefit, the industry is still shakes out this way. And you can see it through the 2022 data. A quarter of the clubs are in the red bucket. Now, those clubs that prior to the pandemic, on the margin, they're doing slightly better. There's no question. But they aren't doing well enough to get out of the red bucket. A quarter of the clubs that are in the green bucket were the clubs that effectively had a wait list before the pandemic and still do, and the wait list has grown in its length. Those are the clubs that do, I won't say they get capital planning exactly right, but those are the clubs in their DNA for the most part that are oriented towards continuous and consistent capital investment, in particular aspirational capital investment, and that's why they're in the green bucket to begin with. And then you get the other half of the industry that's in the yellow bucket. And so, that half of the industry, capital planning, proper capital planning is, in my view of the world, the only bottleneck between the yellow bucket and the green bucket. And we're going to see some data that I hope it lands with everyone on the webinar the way it landed with me, because I think it's incredibly insightful and compelling. And I think it'll motivate action. So, part of the reason these red bucket clubs exist, and part of the reason that not every club is in the green bucket, in my view, but I think it's an informed view, is that too many clubs still are focused on operational governance in terms of the board and the finance committee and the committees. That does not move the financial needle at all. We'll get into that in a minute. Strategic governance, that bearing, that leaning forward, that ability for a board to guide the club into the future rather than worrying about what happened last month on the operating ledger, is critical. It's foundational. Proper capital planning, in my view, is a catalyst to strategic governance. The reason so many clubs are in the operational bucket is because most clubs don't have a proper capital plan. And without that proper capital plan, there isn't a systematic or inert or innate reason to think about the future. And the absence of the capital plan is one of the factors that contributes to operational governance. There's critical questions that every club must answer, even with the benefit of the pandemic, and particularly looking out to the next 10 years as the millennials come of age to join clubs. These questions have to be asked in every single club, even the club that's at the most dire circumstances in the red bucket. What is the vision? What's our vision? Where is the club going in the next 5 or 10 years? In a tangible manner, not in an arm-waving manner, in a detailed manner. What are we doing with our facilities, campus, membership, programming, governance? finances, staffing, and staff development. What are we doing with these things? What's our plan to change them and improve them? Every business has to continuously evolve and improve. What are our services and amenities going to be? Who will our members be? How many members will we have or should we have? How do we know? How will we generate the capital that's necessary to continuously evolve and improve what we offer and the facilities within which we offer them? Success in clubs requires, this is words that we use in the Club Leadership Alliance that we have with Copeland, Keeble, and Wallace and the McMahon Group, enduring relevance, continuous relevance. Red Bucket clubs are basically offering the same stuff they did 30 years ago. In a country club setting, they tend to be 18-hole country clubs with nothing much else. You know, maybe have a pool that looks like a bathtub and it's got tiles falling off, or they got a fitness closet, not a fitness center, and they don't have modern dining. They're not relevant. Relevance continues, demands, by definition, consistent and continuous evolution and growth. And that demands consistent and continuous capital investment and income. This slide, which I know many have seen, but I can't overemphasize the importance of it. I know, speaking for myself, I've learned a whole bunch about clubs in the last 14 years. But this is the most important thing I feel like I've learned and Club Benchmarking has learned, and it didn't fall out of the sky. It took us 7 years of backbreaking work to discover this. We didn't create it, we unearthed it. This is the natural state of the private club industry. The blue line is the operating margin. So it's the operating result divided by the operating revenue. It doesn't account for capital income, leases, which are on the capital ledger, or depreciation expense. Those are on the capital ledger. This is just the operating ledger. As you can see, first off, it's 2022 data. There's 416 clubs, both clubs with and without golf in this data set. And you can see at the median club broke even operationally. Now, the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, that number was close to 5% at the median. The margin, there was a margin, and very few clubs had a deficit. You can see right now, it's exactly the way it was before the pandemic. 50% have a deficit, not a meaningful deficit for most. 50% have a surplus. It's exactly the way it was every single year. We've been collecting data from 2010 to 2019. That's the way it looks. So I would say that's a data point that it suggests, as I said earlier, that we're back where we were prior to the pandemic. Now, the gold line is capital income put into the same context. So it's the total capital income divided by operating revenue. So this median club, the club in the middle, had capital income equal to 18% of its operating revenue. That still shows a benefit. I would suggest that may be related to the demographic shift a bit more than the pandemic, particularly last year. But it does relate to the growth in member count and the growth of initiation fee. Prior to the pandemic, that median would have been 13 or 14%. It's now 18%. And so on the margin, in 2022, clubs had a bit more capital income. The interesting thing is the 25th percentile, which is kind of the break point for the Red Bucket clubs. During the pandemic, that was at 15 or 16%. It's back down to 12. Prior to the pandemic, that was at 10. So these Red Bucket clubs are kind of sliding back to where they were prior to the pandemic. The Yellow Bucket clubs on the margin probably have, have a bit more capital income. And then this upper quartile, the Green Bucket clubs tend to have even more capital income. They've accelerated their initiation fee greater at the before the pandemic, the 25th percentile, the 75th percentile was 20%. Now it's 25. So those Green Bucket clubs are still benefiting because of their higher initiation fees. And I think most of them have been working to increase capital dues recently because they are very focused on consistent capital investment, which is the whole point of this discussion and webinar. But the point
Okay,
here is
Ray,
simply this.
we got two questions on this one, or three now.
Yeah.
Does this graph change for not-for-profit clubs? So you might need to clarify the data.
Yeah. 80% of the clubs in this data set are not-for-profit member-owned clubs. 85% probably to be exact. If it's a for-profit club, there are some of those in here, and it may or may not change. Some for-profit clubs are very mission-oriented and they run operating deficits. Those could be clubs that are in their early stages. They might be clubs that are in a residential community in their early stages, and then other for-profit clubs, to the questioner's point, may have a significant operating surplus. Those are the clubs, if you can see my cursor, that are in the upper quartile where there's a surplus that's outside what we refer to as the break-even zone, plus or minus 4% margin. But most of these clubs are not-for-profit. And just to be clear, not-for-profit is a tax status, not a business model. The profit in not-for-profit clubs, and frankly, the profit in for-profit clubs, it basically emanates, and I don't mean profit, I'm using the term loosely, it emanates from capital income. That's the point, as we can see here. It's capital income that provides the free cash a club has to drive itself forward financially. Capital income is the financial driver, not the operating ledger. Next question, please.
How are you defining capital? Is it initiation fees only, and what about assessments?
It's initiation fee income. It is recurring capital dues, which about 70 to 80% of clubs now have. If a club has a debt service fee, it would include that. If there are capital assessments, it would include that. So it's all of the capital income. Any others?
How do you categorize gain or loss on disposal of assets?
Gain or loss of disposal of assets shows up in the capital income in our model. And it's very marginal, just to be clear. It's definitely there, and every club sees that every year, but it's noise. It's not really of material matter in any way, shape, or form. Any others?
There's a question around the use of debt for aspirational projects, which we can do now, or maybe you're going to cover that.
We'll address that in detail.
Okay, and then someone else asked if they're supposed to be able to see the questions, and they're not. They're confidential to us. How many clubs are non-golf clubs of the 416?
It's a little low. The industry is 80% clubs with golf, 20% clubs without. At this moment, we're about 23% clubs without and 77% with. Just slightly higher than the norm. There's a reason for that. We do a lot of work with yacht clubs. They give us their data early in the year, and that changes it slightly. But it's basically the same as the industry, the normal industry segmentation. So just in summary, and it's critical to understanding proper capital planning, critical. The operating ledger, even though most of the money flows through it, is not the capital driver in clubs, is not the financial driver in clubs. The purpose of the operating ledger is to deliver the member experience. It's consumed year in and year out by members enjoying the club. The capital ledger, capital income and capital investment are the financial driver, and it's what happens on the capital ledger that drives the financial outcome over time in a club. No question about it. And that's why we have been so focused on proper capital planning, because we're trying to help the industry and help clubs change their financial future. You can't change it on the operating ledger, folks. You can only change it on the capital ledger. That's the whole point of this webinar. So using that as context, a couple of critical points. Every club I've ever run into, which is a whole bunch, although I just ran into one, so I shouldn't say every. That's why I said nearly every in the text. Nearly every club I run into, it's a 1 out of 100 type of deal. But 99 out of 100 clubs are very capable at producing a monthly view of the operating ledger / income statement. They review it monthly at the board and finance committee level, and possibly even with the membership. It's a focused review of actual versus budget. And I think that it's done without understanding the previous point. People are very focused on it because everyone thinks that's what's driving the financial outcome, but it isn't. It does involve money, there's no doubt. It involves most of the money at the club. The average club, from the member's perspective, if you amortize their initiation fee over the average tenure of 20 years, 85% of what a member spends at a club flows through the operating ledger, 15% through the capital ledger. So most of the money flows through the operating ledger, but it isn't about financial outcomes. It's about the member experience. And clubs do an amazing job of managing, monitoring, and producing the operating ledger. They've done it through recessions, they've done it through pandemics, and we've done it through good times. But break even is the outcome. Everyone in the clubs dialed into assuring that happens. Is the same effort applied to the capital ledger and the balance sheet? Is the focus and attention the same? The answer, unequivocally in my mind, and I'll take the author's license here, is no, it's not. It's almost, I would say, it would be a 1 out of 500 scenario, and I mean that, where there's a club that puts the same emphasis on the capital ledger and balance sheet as they do on the operating ledger / operating income statement. And that's why we're here. And just as a quick review, based on what we just learned, the net worth, equity, book value, members' equity, stockholders' equity, whatever term you want to apply to the equity portion of the balance sheet, is driven purely by the tension between capital income and depreciation expense, which are both on the capital ledger. And we know from the data, this is trend data. It begins in 2006 and it goes through either 2021 or 2022, and it's for over 1,000 clubs. It's real data. It's completely representative of the industry. This shows the compounded annual growth rate of the equity portion of the balance sheet. 2/3 of clubs do not meet the threshold that allows them to consistently replace their obligatory assets. 2/3. 40% of clubs are worth less today, even with the benefit of the pandemic, in terms of their equity. They're worth less today than they were in 2006. And that's in absolute dollars, that not in inflation adjusted dollars. 2/3 are worth less in inflation adjusted dollars. So that's the reason we did this. This is the reason why we created what we call Compass, which I'm going to get into now. We do use CCV, the Country Club of Virginia, as a best-in-class example of capital planning and net worth growth, and they go hand in hand. Look at the CCV growth of net worth since 2006. It's so smooth and consistent. Every club desires this. Now, there was one down year when the club made a decision at the beginning of the pandemic, 2020. They made a decision to keep all the staff and pay all the staff, even when they were shut down, even when there weren't people using the club, what they made in the same week in the prior year. So they knew they were going to take a hit on the operating ledger, which they decided to do because obviously they had no banquet income and a lot less food and beverage income at the height of the pandemic and then as the year evolved. But that's the perturbation that is logical, and it made sense, and it didn't impact their ongoing continuous growth, as you can see here. So the key here is simply this. In the 1950s, CCV started funding depreciation. So every member at the club, in addition to paying their fair share of operating dues yearly, would pay a proportion of the depreciation expense. It's not the whole depreciation, it's about 70% of it. But the reason that this net worth is so smooth is because they have the capital income to overcome the depreciation expense, and they have it every single year. And it's not subject, I mean, there is noise behind it, the ups and downs of initiation fee income, although that's pretty consistent because they have very systematic churn and they replace people as they leave. But the clubs that are trying to balance the capital books on initiation fee income alone, or on a paucity of capital dues, those are the clubs that have these net worth charts that look like a jigsaw or the edge of a saw, because they're subject to the vagaries of the initiation fee income. So the whole point of proper capital planning is to have smooth capital income that matches depreciation. Depreciation is one of the most consistent expenses a club faces. It's a non-cash expense, obviously, but it doesn't change dramatically year to year. If you do a huge project in one year, yeah, then next year it'll bump. But generally speaking, it's smooth across the industry. So I just put this in I just want to restate what the equity or book value of a club is. It's so critical to understand. It's the sum total of all the capital income in the club's history minus the sum total of all the depreciation that's occurred in the club's history. That's what the book value of a club is. And when you look to the other side of the balance sheet, the assets, it's perfectly logical and symmetrical. This is the epiphany we had 7 years ago. This is what's led us to where we are today. Give or take 80% of what a club owns at a point in time is the net book value of their property, plant, and equipment. And you add one more line item, cash, you get to 90% of the assets. Also trend data from over 1,000 clubs. We've talked about the net to gross. Please.
Someone's asking you to explain what CAGR stands for.
Oh, it's the compounded annual growth rate of the net worth of the club. So over this 16 or whatever it is, 17-year period, if you take the beginning, roughly 39 million book value, and it's about 100 now, the compounded annual growth rate of that is 6.2%.
Okay, and then when evaluating net worth, do you adjust for the value of the land as it increases?
It's a great question, but no. Everything we do, all the analysis we do is done properly, looking at a club as a going concern. So it's assuming that the club will remain a club. Market value doesn't really enter into it. Now, if a club had excess land and it decided to sell some of that to raise capital in the form of cash, that may happen. But the balance sheet of the club doesn't reflect market value for land. Land is not depreciated, and land remains on the balance sheet at all times at the original acquisition cost.
Okay, one more. Where does profit growth come from if capital charges are equal to depreciation?
That's a great question, and we'll look at that. I'll just jump to it right now. Here's an example. It's a yellow bucket club of when capital income matches depreciation. These are real clubs, just to be clear. When a capital income matches depreciation, it's exactly what you get. You get flat net worth over time. Now, it looks like a dead body, EKG, and it should. It's better than the red bucket clubs where the net worth is actually declining, no doubt about it. But this isn't something that's acceptable because it's indicative of the fact that the club isn't generating enough capital to replace the assets it's depreciating because they're more expensive to replace than what we originally paid. So that's exactly what the net worth would look like for a club that has capital income equal to depreciation consistently over time. So we've all heard about the net to gross PP&E ratio, which is a measure of how depreciated the asset base of a club is. It's for any business, it's going to be between 0 and 100%. 0% means all of our assets are fully depreciated. 100% means they're all brand new. I don't want to get into the net to gross so much at this juncture, but I want to relate it to proper capital planning. This shows an actual club. On 12/31/04, the net to gross ratio was 28%, which is in dire straits. They knew they needed to do something. So they took 15 million of debt out and they renovated their clubhouse. And when they finished the projects 2 years later, they jumped all the way to 58%, which is a green flag in our book. That was a result of that investment. So their net to gross doubled. Now, as you could expect, there's going to be an oscillation every year on this metric. Depreciation pulls it to the left, capital investment pushes it to the right. They didn't do a proper capital plan, which this happens, I'll say this happens in 60 to 80% of the clubs that have debt, this is happening in. What they did with that 15 million of debt is they assessed it out to the members so that the members had a monthly amount they paid while the debt was there to pay the debt principal and interest off. So over the next 15 years, I was there in September of 20. In September of 20, they wrote the last check on the debt, paid it off in accordance with that mindset of assessing the debt to the members. But look what happened to the net to gross in that time frame. It slid all the way back to where they were, back into the red bucket. That was because they had enough money to pay the capital debt, the debt service, but they didn't have enough money to keep reinvesting in conjunction with an obligatory capital, aspirational capital, and growing their cash reserves. So this is the hierarchy of capital priorities. This is one of the things that motivates us and motivated Compass. Debt service obviously has to be covered first. Then we got to make sure we're maintaining the assets we own. Then we can invest in growth, which are aspirational assets, new services and amenities that mirror what the new members would like. And if we have enough, we can increase our cash reserves to a level that's acceptable over time. As you can see from this, ideally, every club can penetrate all 4 layers. Most clubs can't penetrate through the second layer. Okay, some can penetrate through the 3rd layer. Very few clubs can penetrate all 4 layers because there's not enough capital income, and there's not enough capital income because there's not a proper capital plan. And anyone that's on this webinar, hundreds of people are here for a reason. My hypothesis is this: if you're on the board or the finance committee or the long range planning committee, or if you're a member of the management team, it gets tiring year after year after year when the management team, the department heads say, here's what we need for capital next year. And the part of the process is to trim it, to say we can't have it. We can't do all of that next year. And this is on the obligatory side because we don't have the money. We're trying to stop that. We should have the money to replace assets before their end of life is experienced in real time. You don't want to replace an HVAC unit because it crapped out on the roof on August 18th when it was 103 degrees out. That's what's going on in the industry. And it's all because there just isn't enough capital money. It's scarce. So we have these long discussions. Clubs spend more time, in my view, triaging capital investments every year, drawing that line, than they do planning for the proper amount of capital. We have to plan, and when I show you some of this data, it's going to make your head spin. We have to plan for obligatory capital, and we have to plan for growth capital. Otherwise, we become irrelevant, and we end up in the red bucket. This is real. These are 3 real clubs. Look at this club on the left. That's 40% of the industry. This is more exaggerated, but 40% of the industry, their net worth is less today than it was in 2006. I showed you that on the compounded annual growth rate chart. Then you got the portion of the industry that's basically flat. And then you get these clubs that are green bucket clubs. This is a real club, probably one of the most well-known clubs in the industry. But they've relied historically, although they've changed it. We did a bunch of work with them and they've changed their approach. They relied on what I'd call episodic planning. you can see the net worth is flat, and then there's a big jump. Well, that big jump is an assessment. And the assessment occurred because all of a sudden, a new project came to life. Then years of flat net worth, and then boom, another jump. That's another assessment. Now you see this increase at the tail here. This is because they went through a proper capital planning process with us, and they tripled their capital dues, and then they index those capital dues to the increase in operating dues every year. So their capital dues are going to increase every year ad infinitum now. And this kind of sawtooth net worth chart, when they look at it 10 years from now, is going to look like CCVs. It's going to be a much smoother trajectory, which is indicative of that fact that they could replace things as they needed rather than waiting and building up until they have an assessment to do a project. So with that, if you think about the way it works today versus what we would term as a proper process, and we've named our process a capital planning process COMPASS, Comprehensive Asset Management. It's an acronym that fits nicely, but COMPASS is great because it denotes a journey, it denotes action, it denotes moving forward, and that's the whole point of this. That's the whole point of capital planning, is the journey of the club forward to the vision. Currently, it's episodic. There's capital plans are done when a new person gets involved. They put their own spreadsheet together. I did it at my own club. I've lived this. I've seen it happen in hundreds of clubs. Or if there's a new project, and then we come up with a plan to do that project. The plan then becomes static. It's not maintained. It isn't easily to maintain because the proper software doesn't exist in the industry. We've developed the proper software now. And then you have these islands of data, islands of database. You got a fixed asset register in one place. You have this capital plan that's episodic in another spreadsheet. It may not even be on the main club's computer. It could be on the treasurer's home computer. And then you got this, what's called a capital reserve study in a PDF file or a binder or another spreadsheet. And then finally, this whole thing adds up to reactive approach. It's when new people enter the fray or when a new project is up versus this. Capital planning should be continuous. If we add or dispose of assets, they should be accounted for monthly, and it should ripple through all of the functions: fixed asset register, the forward-looking capital plan, and the asset inventory and assessment report. We need that all to be integrated, just as we do with the operating ledger. It's got to be updated monthly. We focus so much on updating the operating ledger, we don't have time for the capital ledger, and we don't have the tools. It's got to be the only way it is going to work is if all these functions are integrated into one platform and all of the data is integrated into one database. And I'm going to guess there's a fair number of CFOs or controllers on the webinar today, and I'm kind of hearing them right now say, thank you, God, someone's saying this, because they are faced with an impossible task in the way that it's done now with this segregated functions. And then finally, we know, you'll know, if you have a proper capital plan when you're discussing it regularly, when it enjoys as much focus and intensity as the operating ledger does. I want to make a point about obligatory capital here. This is critical. Look, we're part of this. I'll define it as a problem for this industry. We, 5 years ago, got into the capital reserve study database, this reserve study business, because we knew that capital planning was critical based on what I've just showed. But we've learned, this is the whole point, we're not static. No one should be static. No company, no club, no business. Over the years, what we've recognized is clubs don't need capital reserve studies. Condominiums do. It's a completely different world. It isn't even the right format necessarily for clubs. What clubs need are forward-looking capital plans, and the asset inventory assessment and replacement cost activity is an input to the capital plan. But the difference between condominiums and clubs is all of this. Clubs have significant debt. Clubs also do aspirational capital. Condominiums don't, for the most part. Clubs have membership intake and attrition, and they have multiple categories and hundreds of members. Now, some large condominiums have lots of residents, and people do move in and move out, but they don't usually have initiation fees or, upfront capital fees. A few do. And in condominiums, you're doing a project maybe once a year. You do the roof, or you do the parking lot, or you might do the balconies. But it's not an every month. It's not a continuous process. Clubs have much more extensive diversity in their assets, and they're constantly updating obligatory capital through investment. It's not once or twice a year. It's every month. So that's the why we're doing what we do. What is proper capital planning? It's this, simply. It's a systematic process plus an application-specific software platform, plus a continuous asset inventory, useful life, and replacement cost assessment. That's the reserve study with the right words for the club industry, plus the continuous update of aspirational plans, which can change over the course of a year, and then the regular review and monitoring that we give to the operating ledger. That equals proper capital planning. So what Compass is, the software platform, and not just the platform, this is a program. It includes a process that we contribute with you to. It's the merging of the fixed asset register, the capital plan spreadsheet, and what we'll use this term, the reserve study for the moment. It's putting all that functionality and software into one platform. And the whole purpose of it is so that every club can penetrate consistently, year in and year out, the hierarchy of capital priorities. This is a flow chart of what Compass is, the program, the process. So what we have to do is we have to calculate and quantify as precisely as we can and as accurately as we can the projected resources, which are our initiation fees, our capital dues, and our assessment income. But we can't do that. I've seen it. I've looked at hundreds of capital plans from clubs. They all pretty much, there's a few exceptions, I'll grant that. But for the most part, they're all top down. They're not bottom up. You need a year by year, category by category, detailed intake and attrition of membership to get this data accurately quantified. Okay, then there's other capital resources. We have to project the operating result year by year because it's either going to add to, or in some clubs it could add to, in some clubs it could detract from our capital income. In most clubs it's a break-even outcome, so it's easy, as I showed. But every club has to know that. And then we have to model our needs, our uses accurately. The obligatory needs year by year, the aspirational needs, that's fed by the asset inventory assessment and replacement cost. The aspirational needs are fed by the facilities and campus vision that's tied to the strategic plan. We need the debt service in detail as it is to the penny. We can do that. And we need any other capital needs. That's all done in the first instance in the Compass program to quantify what we call the as-is base case, which is ultimately identifying the gap between the projected needs and resources for the next 10 years. And there is a gap in every club by definition. I just showed the net worth over time. So we know 2/3 of clubs can't meet obligatory needs consistently. So there is a gap. Once the gap is identified, we can aim towards a framework. And the framework is that recurring capital dues cover obligatory capital, and initiation fee income covers aspirational capital and debt. And then we can, once we've identified the gap and we start to aim the trajectory for 10 years into those buckets, we can, with the right software platform, which I'm going to show you in a minute, we can model different strategies to close the gap. the whole point of this activity is to identify the correct means given a given club's culture, a given club's situation, what proportion should be coming from recurring capital dues versus assessments versus initiation fee income. We have to model various alternatives, which isn't easy to do in a spreadsheet, but it's easy to do in an application specific program. And when we get that alternative, we can then use it as our new base case, and then we can keep it up to date, which is what we propose doing. We update it as obligatory needs, as adds and disposals occur. We update it annually with replacement costs that are recent and inflation estimates looking forward. And then we have an new annual base case every year, which we just keep fresh unless there's a big project at the club, in which case we have to do that asset inventory and replacement work again so that we have it accurate to reflect the changes that were occurred as a result of the project. And then we can feed that data right back into our model. So this is a dynamic model. It doesn't start, it starts with the base case. It never ends once the base case is established and the Compass program is put in place. With that, I'm going to take a quick moment to show you the platform. So this, I might have to share. Can you see my screen still? Terry, can you see the capital cash flow projection now?
Mm-hmm.
We're good? So here's something that everyone here today is familiar with. This is a capital cash flow projection. Shows the beginning cash balance. This is an actual base case that we did. It accounts for the operating projections. It accounts for initiation fee income, all the income. I got to go a little fast because I'm running behind. It calculates what we call net available capital. Then it accounts for all the capital uses, obligatory and aspirational. It accounts for the debt service and whether we're going to pay additional principal. And when all is said and done, you get to the bottom line, which in this case, as you can see for this club, is a sea of red ink. That means they have a gap between their projected needs and their projected resources. There's one massive difference between this capital cash flow and the ones that 99 out of 100 clubs do. And that massive difference is none of the numbers in this projection were entered into the projection. They were all a result of work from the bottom up. So I can't show you everything, but you can see on the left of the screen, membership and pricing, membership intake and attrition assumptions, the operating ledger projection, and the cash flow associated with that for the next 10 years. The capital dues and initiation fees. Does our club allow initiation fees to be paid in installments? Our loans and debt service. Do we have capital assessments? Our obligatory needs as manifested by our asset reserve study and asset replacement and cost database. Any other aspirational capital investment, and then any other sources and uses of capital. I'm going to quickly go through each of these so that you can see. No, I'm going to have to go back to it, but that's fine. I was out of it for too long. So you can see what's there. So this is a complete membership modeling, category by category. We institute every category that your club has, and we put in all of the particulars for the current situation. Then we go through for every single year in the model, the intake and attrition by category, and whether even to the detail of whether there's transfers in or out of the category, which would affect the capital income vis-a-vis initiation fee income and or capital dues. So we go through that for all 10 years in all categories. We model the operating ledger so that we know what the operating result is expected to be, and we can adjust it in the 10-year model. We can adjust the rate, the non-dues revenue, the operating expenses, and the dues increases incrementally, individually, so that we can get to a result where we know what the projected operating result is year by year in a detailed manner. We go through capital dues and initiation fees for all categories for the entire period of the planning cycle. So every category, what are the capital dues? What's the initiation fee? What percent are financed, et cetera, et cetera. If they're financed, we go through every single category, what percent finances or what the assumptions are behind that. This is detailed and it's purposeful because we're trying to do this accurately. We can put in our existing loans or any new loans that we project in the future. It's as simple as adding a loan and you can put in the years. All the amortization's done automatically. You can pick different loan types. You can name the loan. You can put the amortization period. You can put the interest rate, start date, et cetera. If there's a balloon payment, you can put the month it's due. Assessments. You can name capital assessments in conjunction with your strategic plan. So it uses your club's own language so people understand what it means. You can put as many assessments in as you like. You can do them top down or bottom up. Top down means how much money does the club need to get in an assessment? Bottom up means what are we willing to charge a full member, and everything else will ripple through all the categories in a prorated manner. The obligatory needs are cited. Here's an example. These are real obligatory needs off of a asset replacement database or a reserve study. This is what you usually see in forward-looking capital plans in clubs. The same number every year, and it's a round number. Every time I see that in a capital plan, I know there isn't a real capital plan because a real capital plan reflects real replacement costs, not estimated replacement costs. Aspirational capital investment can be entered and named just the same way you would refer to projects in your strategic plan or your own vision, and you can institute exactly how much you're projecting you will need for the aspirational project and in what year it'll occur. You can have multiple projects per year. And then any other additional sources and uses of capital, like if you were going to sell land or if you were going to, maybe use money to do a fine. These are just examples right here. So that's the input. Those are all the assumptions. They go into a database and they reside in the database ad infinitum. And that rolls up into the capital cash flow projection. That's detailed. That's comprehensive. We didn't create this. This was a result of all of the work that was done. And then finally, the whole thing is surrounded by Microsoft Power BI, which is the world's leading business intelligence platform. We don't need to create graphs. You don't need to create graphs. Anyone who's trying to communicate this to members needs graphs and charts, and you can do all sorts of graphs and charts with one click of a button, but it isn't our software that's creating this. We're not going to compete with Microsoft in terms of power, in terms of business intelligence. We're going to use it. So it's integrated into the platform and you don't have to goof around with it in Excel anymore. So that's the platform. Now I'll go back to the webinar and I want to show, please, I got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to show some real data. This is from 54 clubs and it's real data. This is what the recurring capital dues were before and after. So the base case is the as-is case that we did initially. So across the 54 clubs, the average per year per FME capital dues were $1,287. After we went through the process that we just saw, they ended up at $2,521. That's a $100 difference a month. This is what I referred to earlier, saying I think this would get the head spinning and hopefully excitement. Because the reality is every club is closer to having the right answer than they think. We've noticed this. We've done more than 54 clubs. I've only used 54 clubs for this data set because I was doing the slides a little too late, but I could quickly put my hands on that data. But what we've noticed is just roughly the difference between being able to satiate the obligatory capital needs and all of the capital needs in the before and after case, it's about $100 to $150. I'd say that's the typical window a month per member. That's not crazy stuff. And it doesn't have to happen all in 1 year. Most of the clubs, this gradual increase is built in over a 2, 3, 4 year period of time. Net available capital is all of the capital that's available, initiation fee, assessments, etc. This is the net available capital change per FME. It goes from 3,500 to 4,900. So you can see there that most of the increase is driven by the change in recurring capital dues, which is exactly what we thought might be the case when we started all this work, because we had a hunch that what's happened in the industry historically, and the reason 2/3 of clubs' net worth hasn't kept up with inflation, is because members aren't doing what CCV did in 1954. They aren't contributing a money in conjunction with their consumption through depreciation. So that's ultimately, if you go through the Compass program, what you're going to quantify is what's the amount that would make sense in our club, given our deferred maintenance, given our asset base, given our member count, given everything that we have, what's the right amount that we should be charging our members such that the obligatory needs are met as they occur, rather than the snowball of kicking the can down the road. Another thing that I noticed, which I think is incredibly powerful, is this. This is the base case. This is the selected strategy. This is for the 54 clubs. There isn't a huge change in the obligatory. Most of these clubs, to be clear, had we'll use the old word, a reserve study. I'll use the new word, asset inventory assessment and replacement cost database from us. So they knew that going in. So there wasn't a huge change in the obligatory capital spending. But there is a significant change in the aspirational spending, and that's a beautiful thing because it goes to the original point of operational versus strategic governance. That's indicative of the fact that if we go through the proper capital planning process, we will start to think strategically about how we're going to evolve the club. That was the whole point at the outset of this. So you can see that there is a significant growth in aspirational spending, and there's a slight uptick in debt. But remember, please, this debt service and all of this money is funded in the selected strategies across the 54 clubs. All of the money is funded looking forward for 10 years. There isn't a gap anymore. So that is a synopsis of why we need to do capital planning properly and how it's done properly. It's not a top-down activity. It's a bottoms-up activity. It demands the right software and the right process. Before we go, here's a few warning signs of improper capital planning. Just what I just said. It's top-down. Initiation fee income and other income has arrived at the top line rather than through real membership modeling bottoms up. Depreciation is used to quantify obligatory capital rather than an asset inventory assessment and replacement cost database, or what at the old words were capital reserve study. We're going to use the new words, we're repositioning, because we're in the club industry. We don't do those assessments for condominiums. Others do, and sometimes they step into clubs. We think that's a mistake. We have data that would support that point. But you can't use depreciation. You have to use replacement cost. When I open up a capital plan, I won a beer bet with a club about 6 weeks ago. They said, Ray, we did a lot of work on this plan. You'll never find a hole in it. I said, send it to me, please. I was on a Zoom. I bet them a beer. I opened it up, and in 30 seconds, I'm like, hey, you've got obligatory capital. They're using our term. That's good. You've got $500,000 every single year for the 10 years. Your depreciation's $2.2 million. You think your obligatory needs are actually going to be $500,000 every single year? Of course they aren't. I won the beer. I haven't collected it yet, but I'm going to. That's what happens. It's a superficial approach. It can't be done superficially. It would be like saying at the end of the month, when we roll up the operating ledger, we just put round numbers in for what the operating result was, what the dues revenue was. We would never stand for that. We can't stand for it in capital planning. There is little or no aspirational capital in the model. That isn't the case. We don't want that to be the case, as we just saw in clubs that have done it with what we believe is the proper process. That was one of the places where the needle moved the most. If you don't think there's a gap between your needs and your resources in what you might be considering your plan, you probably don't have a proper capital plan. We've taken over 100 clubs through this process. All but one had gaps in the forward-looking needs and resources when the plan was done correctly. And if you can't model different alternatives in minutes, literally, if you can't just say, hey, here's an alternative with capital dues at $2,000 a year, here's a different one with capital dues at $3,000 a year, or one of them has an assessment and one doesn't, or one has a membership count that's flat and one has a growing. If you can't do that in minutes, switch between models, then you really haven't constructed a proper capital plan. And I'll tell you why. Because when you get in front of the members to discuss this, members are very smart. A lot of times I have a problem doing presentation to boards. Presidents of clubs, maybe GMs, they often will say to me, hey, Ray, the members will never understand that. I don't buy that for a second. The people on the board and the finance committee are members. Now, I'm not saying everyone's a financial guru, but we've done this over 100 times in clubs. People get it. And you know what they notice? I've noticed they notice when data and diligence are used. And they also notice when there's a lack of data and diligence. So to be able to stand up in front of the membership, if you're asking for an extra $1,500 a year for capital dues and say, we have developed the base case, here's how we did it, here's the detail, here's the platform, here's the process, they get a sense that we actually did it right. And that's when it passes without difficulty. It's never going to pass 100%. It just isn't the way the world is. But it's where you get the 80% and 90% votes when it's done right. So capital planning, as we look at net worth and we're coming off this high of the pandemic and we're looking at this trajectory for millennials, capital needs are urgent in this industry. I'm convinced of that. The data shows it. I showed the data that allows me to drive that conclusion. We have to do something about it. A proper process and a proper software platform are required to do that. The focus needs to be as intense and consistent as regards the operating ledger. And time is always of the essence in this regard. I was on a webinar today with the club we've been talking to for 5 years, and they basically haven't pulled the trigger yet. It just makes things worse every year. If you have deferred maintenance, which most clubs do, the sooner we address it, the easier it is. The longer we wait, the more expensive it becomes by definition. Now, in terms of updating the plan monthly in the Compass program, we do that with the clubs. We've built the software platform now, and we are integral to it. It's not just a software platform. It's the expertise, it's the replacement cost data, it's the additions and disposals, and understanding how to keep that up to date in real time. We're already doing that monthly update of additions and disposals for about 10 clubs, and we're probably going to be doing it for 100 or more by the end of this year. So this is a process, it's a program that includes a software platform that allows each club to quote unquote do it right.
Right, we have more questions than we're going to be able to tackle, like 40 some questions. So we're going to have to divide and conquer with the regional partners and yourself to get those answered. But somebody asked just that question you were addressing. Is it available as a tool clubs can access, or is it part of a consulting offering or a hybrid? And I think maybe you didn't say that it's subscription based.
It's a subscription model, as Terry said. Instead of making it episodic, instead of in the future now when we're doing it, what we've done in the past, I'll admit it, we kind of went into it the way others were doing it. Instead of charging for a reserve study or charging for a capital plan, it's an annual fee. You get the software platform, and you get the monthly updates. You send us your additions and disposals, we input them into the database, and everything ripples through. So it is a recurring software and service program.
Okay, so we're almost 10 after right now.
Do you have any, you want, give me another one or two, and then I don't know how many people we still have, but
We
let's just take one or two
have
more. Terry, to see some.
335 people right now still on 390 at the peak.
Okay, so
Hold on. Trying to get back to this. Please ask Ray how CB classifies greens renovations, irrigation replacement. Is that obligatory or aspirational?
obligatory.
Okay, easy enough. Can you show the full capital cash flow projection chart again, please?
Sure. It is that button, and I'll just show it and gradually move down the screen. But it starts with the beginning capital cash, which obviously carries over year to year. We input the operating result based on the operating modeling. And then the various and sundry capital income, which is all bottoms up again. It's not tops down. That gets us our total capital income and what we refer to as net available capital. Net available capital is the adjustment ultimately for the operating result. Then we have the capital expenditures, obligatory and aspirational. Obligatory quantified by the asset assessment, inventory, and replacement cost database. Aspirational capital informed by the strategic plan and the vision of the club. Any other additional uses, then the debt service that results in the cash flow from debt, because it could be inputs. If you have new loans like this club did, that's proceeds from the new debt. And then the debt service for that shows up in the future. And then your bottom line annual capital cash flow, and this is a base case, so it shows the gap between the projected needs and resources, which is the next stage is to close that gap, as I discussed, by turning the various knobs, mainly the capital dues knob and the initiation fee income knob, but potentially an assessment knob, although we're not fans of assessments. We'd rather lean on the capital dues and initiation fee income. Assessments, in our view, are indicative of reactive capital planning.
Okay.
Anything else?
I have a whole lot more, but none of them are simple. Do you want to keep going?
Yeah, I think we'll take one more and then we'll call it, and maybe we'll pick it up again on another one in the next week or two.
Okay. We can also formalize the questions and your responses and share them so that the ones that are, the group might be pervasive in the group. Is there an industry benchmark for capital coverage ratio similar to a debt service coverage ratio for the operating?
Yeah, I'd say this, that when you look at all that data and the clubs that we've done this for, and all clubs, some clubs we haven't done it for, and we can look at the growth in net worth and the change in net worth relative to the actual financial outcome. I would say this, there's a rule of thumb that we use that I think is probably fairly accurate, and it is this, that at a minimum, it's a minimum, at a minimum, the capital income should be 20% of the operating revenue, and the capital dues ideally would be around 20% of the operating dues. So if you use that as a rough rule of thumb, 20% capital income in relation to operating, that's the minimum, not the maximum. It could be higher based on what the plan is and how much deferred maintenance there is. But that's a rule of thumb that we would use in terms of coverage. And give it about 75%, a little bit more now after the pandemic, of clubs have debt. So that would include the capital income necessary to cover the debt service in addition to the capital investments. And with that,
Okay,
Terry, I guess we will say good evening.
good afternoon, good evening for you, good night for you.
And good morning for those of our friends on the West Coast.
Right, exactly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll consolidate the questions, and I will be sending a PDF of the deck and a link to the recording of the session. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.